Hi, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Concerts and Conversations. I'm Matthew Dirst, the artistic director of Ars Lyrica, and with me today is Abigail Fischer, one of our two sopranos in our upcoming production of Handel's Aminta e Fillide, a delightful pastoral cantata from 1708. Abigail, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to work with you and excited for this presentation.
It's great to have you here and back in Houston. Abigail has got strong Houston roots.
Absolutely. Yeah, my parents both teach at Rice, and I studied cello at University of Houston, and I did the whole regional all-state route as a high school cellist and singer. And I'm always happy to come. And I'm also a student of Stephen King, who just is retiring from Rice University as well. And so I'm always happy to come back and explore the ever-growing, expanding, evolving Houston.
And we're delighted to have you here. And special treat for those of you who've tuned in for this episode, Abigail's actually going to play the cello and sing at the same time in an excerpt that we're using at the end of this segment. So stay tuned to the bitter end.
Yes, indeed.
So the piece we're offering on the subscription program, Handel's Aminta e Fillide, comes from a series, really, of Italian language cantatas that he wrote during his youth in Rome. These kinds of pieces celebrate the pastoral world of idyll and intrigue, as we're calling this program itself, with some really very evocative lyrics that usually blend a shepherd with a shepherdess, and oftentimes the shepherdess that wants to play with the shepherd and withhold her affection. And we hear endless complaints from the shepherd and jokes and other asides from the shepherdess. This is a slightly rare beast in that in this particular libretto and work, the guy gets the girl and they're seemingly happy by the end. That doesn't happen all that often in these pieces. So this is an exceptional piece in several regards. One of the other nice features of it is that it's a cantata at a certain length. It's about an hour long. And it involves a series of 10 arias plus a duet, each separated with recitatives. Some of the music gets reused in other places in Handel's career, and Handel himself borrowed a few ideas for this piece from Reinhard Kaiser, an important colleague of his at the Hamburg Opera, from whence he'd just come when he came to Italy in his 20s. Abigail, any preliminary observations just on the piece itself, on your work thus far on it, before we sample a few excerpts?
Yeah, I was rereading the libretto today and reflecting on when you first reached out and said, "Would you like to perform this piece?" I remember being very skeptical because it is one of those rare moments of the guy gets the girl,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and like, so is it just this superficial, like, yay, like, yay, we're happy now? And and I was looking again today at the roots of the deeper meanings, and then the book that you so beautifully referred me to, Handel's Orpheus. I was reading it that that people listening during the time would be naturally looking for these multiple levels. There's maybe the guy gets the girl or the girl gets the girl, or however you want to put it, um, in that sort of like superficial level, and then there's the spiritual level, which people would be looking for all these multiple levels because they're very familiar with these myths, and also the historical um, level of the Spanish political um, luring of Ruspoli in as an ally for the War of the Spanish Succession, which I found really interesting, so that they would be aware of all these different levels. For me, I feel like it's super obvious that it's not just a love tale.
Yeah, you're
Uh,
right to point out that these librettos always have multiple levels, many of which we don't really understand anymore, just because the allegories they mine are so out of date, really, and they're not part of our sort of common currency anymore. That said, we all know who Cupid is, hopefully, the boy god and the blind boy god as well. Cupid's always said to have blinders on because, of course, when he shoots his arrow, he's not always aiming with great accuracy, which is why you fall in love when you fall in love and not when you plan to. So that's part of the whole story with Cupid.
and for me, like in my own personal like spiritual work, I am definitely very interested in the possibility that the baby God is really baby Jesus. And then it's not necessarily like obvious that it's baby Jesus, so to speak, but that, like, for example, Aminta at the right before the last duet says, I can repeat that never was a faithful soul seen to utter laments in vain. It's like, well, how many times has that actually happened in a love story? Like, probably a lot. But like, if your heart is really true, and you point your faith, um, with utter laments towards God, you will always be satisfied. So that, for me, like, that leads very, very clear that it's about something deeper spiritually. Like, even if the shepherd and the shepherdess end up being together, it's a much deeper, true union.
The play on words that you alluded to a moment ago, the blind God or the child God, also being somehow representative of the Christ child, that may well be. This pastoral society that sponsored these kinds of performances liked these multiple layered allegories, some of which were obvious and right there at the surface for people who heard these pieces initially, and others that they had to think about and unpack. And the fact that they were typically performed at events that included more than just music, in other words, a conversation about the piece and about the libretto and its poetry, suggests strongly to me that they took time to unpack those stories and tried to explain them to each other. That's not a common feature of concert life anymore, alas. For that, we depend on program notes and occasional speeches from the curtain to enlighten the audience.
In the Se vago il rio, like in Aminta's aria, right before Fillide finally feels that, the pang of the wound of the blind God, like, coming, finally, like, awakening in her. It's that allegory of the river going into the sea. And so, like, that is a very well known allegory, but it could be sexual union, but it's like, it's much deeper than that. Even if it's two people coming together, it's in a spiritual way. It has to be. It's much deeper, especially in the very end, where they say, um, let um, let him turn his heaven to the gods, who in the splendor of those fair eyes would nourish hope of one day finding compassion. Like, who would end a love tale with that? Like, compassion, pietà, is like the last word in the whole thing. Like, even though it goes back to the A section, but like, I just found that so stunning. And it's just much deeper than it initially seems. And it is so lovely, and so it feels like so baroque, that there are so many different levels to go into.
Abigail, one of the many layers that these kinds of librettos and these kinds of pieces often present us with are gendered or sexualized roles. And sometimes those roles were rather confused in the early 18th century, especially when parts for sopranos were sung by men, that is to say, castrati, versus women. We know for this piece that the two original performers were in fact both biological women, both sopranos. But there are just as many cantatas from this era, in Handel's life at least, where the soprano part was sung by a castrato. And that could have been the role of a young man. It could have been the role of a youth, as it is in this case. It could even indicate cross-dressing, in other words, singing the part of a soprano. So the two entwining voice parts that we have in this piece, both sopranos, who do sing a lot in parallel thirds and sixths in the final duet where they finally get together, is quite illustrative of that oddly not ungendered character roles, but roles in which gender is a little bit, well, really deliberately confused.
Yeah, I mean, that we really put gender and gender roles into a box, like, much more than according to my reading, that existed in the Baroque era. And actually, it's really interesting what in that book, Handel's Orpheus, what she says is, that women like were less educated, so that actually like, that men, in order to really have like a relationship, that they were actually much more appropriately paired, because the men would have been very educated, and then it wasn't necessarily like a homosexual relationship wouldn't have been necessarily like identified as like this is my part of my identity, that it was just much more fluid. um, and I think that's probably much closer to how reality actually works. It's just, our culture has gone one direction.
Yeah.
So I think it's, yeah, I mean, and I absolutely, in my own identity, like now with that we're much more aware of all these the fluidity of gender identity. That I always felt very comfortable playing men, and that like that we all have these feminine and masculine and in between parts like within ourselves, and like what do we choose to shine forward, or to that feels like resonance, in us.
It would be certainly a nice byproduct of our current interest society-wide in being less specific about gender and allowing in more variety and more categories. It would be great if one nice byproduct of that was a more serious engagement with Baroque opera, especially, since there's such a lot of gender confusion, not just men and women essentially changing places, but people becoming frogs, for example.
Ooh, yes,
Anthropomorphism.
so fun.
In French Baroque opera, I can think of one great example, at least where the lead singer, the lead character rather, in a Remo opera is actually a frog.
Yes, that's so true. And to bring it back to like Aminta, for example, is the shepherd, like perhaps the male character, but is definitely like the higher role.
Yeah, it
Uh,
may strike some listeners as odd who attend the program that Aminta, the man's part in this, is actually the higher role of the two. The woman sings in a slightly lower register. We should sample some more music. There's an aria about halfway through Aminta e Fillide, E un foco quel d'amore, that Fillide, the female character that Abigail sings, delivers, that reappears just a few years later in Agrippina as sung by the character Poppaea. It's got some memorable stops and starts in it, which were great fun to work out in our production of Agrippina. And I think we're going to see now an excerpt from that production with this aria, which originally was in Aminta e Fillide. So Abigail, that aria that we just heard is full of rhetorical questions. You keep asking, ma come? Non si sa. Ma come? Non si sa. What do you think about those rhetorical questions? What kind of mood are you going to try to conjure with them? What do they do for your character?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the journey that this character takes, first of all, it's very clear that Aminta has been pursuing her for quite some time before this, because the first recit is like, okay, for once, just stop and listen to me, see my constancy, and then you can make your decision. Then if you decide that it's not going to work, then that's fine. But like, so clearly, like we start the whole journey at that point where she's been following her for a while. So that's important. And then there's this, so Fillide at first is very cold, and her heart is very closed off. Um and I think she's scared, because she says Aminta says, like, why why are you not even giving me a chance? And she said, well, because I would not have the spring and the brook swollen with water of my tears. So she wants to protect herself. She's closed off because, well, either something's happened in the past that was negative, or she just sees that so many people are, falling with these like unsuccessful love stories, and it hurts so much, and she wants to protect herself. So she closes herself off. Um, but but then there is a point at which she decides, after Se Vago Rio, the one that I was talking about with the beautiful aria of Aminta's, um, with the river meeting the sea. There is this opening. There's an opening where she's finally just like softening her heart a little bit to let something in, and indeed love does enter her. And she's kind of like, oh, and like, what's happening? But I can feel the magic of this love, like, enter of the blind god.
Mhm.
Whether you want, whether it's Cupid or whether it's Jesus, like, whatever, that love is entering me finally. And then it's like she's still like, what just happened? Like, I can feel this, but like, it's probably, this whole episode has probably been going on for a really long time. So like, kind of in this sense of awe, um still, and not, and disbelief too, because like, we don't even know how long. There could be like a whole montage before this of like years, of pursuit, and her heart becoming more and more cold as she says, no, 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 no. So this moment is like more potent the more that you like imagine how long this montage went on for. And like, with us culturally, we can see that we all get stuck into these like little boxes, and more and more and more hardened into our perspective. And like, so what would that be like to just allow the openness to feel something new, and to feel the profundity of like love's arrow?
You bring up a really good point there about Filide's vulnerability, and her the reason she asks these questions, ma come non si sa, and waits for an answer, is because, of course, she doesn't know what the right answer is. She's allowed herself to feel love, and she's kind of struck dumb by it. If this were an opera, it would be the beginning of the third act, and her character, the soprano, would be alone on stage in the dark, asking, "Why has this happened to me?" That's
Yeah.
kind of standard practice in a Baroque opera.
Yeah, it's like that moment of unknowing is like a pure potential,
Hmm.
and a place of growth, clearly, like, for and transformation.
Yep,
That's
absolutely.
Yeah.
For our last musical excerpt today, Abigail played and sang some Handel for us. Abigail, do you want to say a word about this before we hear it?
Sure, it's just the A section of an aria, a prayer from Theodora, and I would have loved to do both parts, but recording all yeah, all of this myself, during the pandemic, it turned out pretty complicated, and I figured one of these is just enough, especially how slow I went, so
It's a beautiful piece. Theodora's always been on my short list of oratorios. Haven't quite gotten around to it yet, but we will eventually. It's a
Yeah.
fantastic piece of music from fairly late in his life, that celebrates well, it honors the memory of an early Christian martyr.
Yeah, and I also love the fact that, it's in English. I find that there's a specific, resonance of being able to hear your native tongue sung in the music.
Abigail, thank you so much for sharing your vocal and instrumental talents with us today and your thoughts on Handel and on Aminta e Fillide. We look forward to a broadcast performance on Friday, the 21st of May. And I'm very much looking forward to digging into some Handel with both you and Lauren this week.
Absolutely. I'm really looking forward to it.